The airlock seal cracked open and the smell hit me first. Recycled air, old metal, and something faintly chemical that I could not name. I stepped through before the door had fully finished moving and planted both feet on the deck of Verith Station like I owned a piece of it. I did not own anything here. That was the whole problem, and every decision made in the next 24 hours was going to hinge on whether we could change it. My name is Yara Voss, Commander, United Earth Fleet. On the morning I arrived at Verith Station, I commanded 3 ships, 41 crew members, and a mission that officially did not exist yet. The mission had a name inside certain sealed files on Earth. Out here, it had no name at all. It had a message I was waiting for, and a window of time measured in hours. The Catholic coordination officer waiting at the dock entrance was young, polished, and completely uninterested in us. His name tag read Thrail. His rank insignia placed him roughly equivalent to a junior port administrator. The Catholic had sent him specifically because of that. It was a message delivered without words, the first of many they intended to send over the next 2 days. We are the Catholic Interstellar Compact, and you are 3 ships from a species we have already assessed, already categorized, and already written the outcome for. Welcome to Verith Station. Please follow the junior officer to your assigned wing. For Commander Voss, his translation caller rendered his voice in flat, clean English. Bay 19 Gamma has been assigned to your vessels. Wing 7 has been prepared for your delegation. The partnership discussion opens tomorrow at the 3rd hour of station day. If you require anything, please contact my office. He turned and began walking. Before I could say anything in return, Lieutenant Owen Drake fell into step beside me as we followed the guide markers toward Wing 7. Owen was 26, square-jawed with light brown hair. He kept cut short and a face trained by 3 years of fleet service to reveal exactly nothing in situations that clearly bothered him. He was using that training right now. Bay 19 Gamma, he said, voice low. That is behind the fuel reclamation block. I know the Sulkai delegation is in Bay 4. The Irani got Bay 2. I know that as well. He said nothing more. He understood when a point had been made. Ver Station was 6 km across at its widest point and old in the way that only things maintained by many hands across many centuries become old. It had been built, expanded, partially demolished, and rebuilt so many times that its internal architecture had become a record of every species that had touched it. The Cathali had built the newest sections, high ceilings, clean lines, surfaces the color of pale bone, corridors wide enough for species with radically different body plans to pass each other without incident. Deeper, older corridors were lower and rounder and smelled faintly of something I could not identify, built for bodies that no longer passed through them. History had layers here that you could feel in the air. We passed 4 delegation wings on the walk to Wing 7. Each had a Catholic senior officer posted outside its entrance. Each wing was visibly larger than the last. The Irani wing had a receiving lounge visible through its open door, polished and formal. The vet wing had 2 attendants posted, not 1. Wing 7 had none of that. Wing 7 had a door, 6 rooms behind it, and a viewport that overlooked the station's interior dock. Rather than the stars, I stood at that viewport for a long time after the crew dispersed. Outside, fuel canisters moved along magnetic rails in slow, deliberate arcs between storage bays and loading platforms, supply shuttles trace their routes with the reliable efficiency of machines that have performed the same task enough times that it no longer requires a decision. The entire interior economy of the station was visible from this angle. It was the view of someone who services things rather than someone who determines them. I turned from the viewport. My 4 senior officers had gathered in the lounge behind me without being asked. Clara Webb, navigation chief, had taken the chair nearest the glass. She was 43, quiet, and had a way of sitting that made you think she was about to say something important even when she was perfectly still. Danny Ford, communications lead, had his tablet in his hand before he finished sitting down. Priya Nalan, medical officer, stood against the far wall with her arms folded in the way she always stood when she was paying close attention to multiple things simultaneously. Owen sat directly across from me and opened his notepad. I laid the situation out plainly, the way I always preferred to work. Tomorrow we would sit across a table from representatives of the most powerful political structure in this region of space, the Cathali Interstellar Compact, controlled faster than light corridor access across a 100 light-year radius, administered 41 member species, and had 3 centuries of experience processing situations exactly like this one. They were going to hand us a document. The document would offer Earth full membership in the compact. It would look generous. It would detail access to the trade network, protection under the compact's military umbrella, and formal recognition of Earth as a space-faring civilization. In exchange, it would require resource extraction commitments, corridor access fees and restrictions, and a seat on the governing council, where the Cathali held 3 of the 5 decisive votes. It was the same document, refined across 300 years of practice, that had brought every other species this region to the same outcome. Our job tomorrow was to sit in the room, ask questions, take notes, and not sign anything. Not sign anything, Clara said. Her voice was level. That is the directive. That is part of the directive, I said. What is the other part? Priya asked from the wall. I checked my personal comm. The channel I was monitoring was quiet. The other part will be available when it arrives, I said. Priya looked at me for a moment, then nodded. She had known me long enough to understand that answer. The briefing ended. The crew went to their rooms. I sat alone in the lounge with a cup of coffee that went cold while I was thinking, and watched the fuel canisters move outside the glass. 20 years, that was the number that had governed everything from the moment Director Caroline Hale stood before the combined Earth Council and made an argument that changed the vote. Earth had received the Compact's first formal membership invitation, and the Council had considered it and chosen to request more time before committing to any agreement. The Cathal agreed immediately because they always agreed to delays from new arrivals. Every new species needed time to accept its situation. The Cathali had seen it happen dozens of times. The delay changed nothing from their perspective. The outcome was already written. What they did not know was that Director Hale had decided to use the time differently. She had described it to me once in a meeting room I was officially never in, speaking with the particular precision of someone who has stopped measuring words against how they will be received and started measuring them only against whether they are accurate. She said the compact's offer was not membership, it was classification. They had assessed Earth, decided what role Earth would play in their structure, and written a document to formalize it. The offer of more time was not generosity, it was the same certainty expressed differently. She said she intended to give them a reason to revise their certainty. The meeting ended. I signed nothing. I was cleared into a program with no public name and told to report to a facility that did not appear on any accessible record. I had been 28 years old. I said yes before she finished explaining what yes meant. Now I was 41, and the message I had been waiting for had not yet arrived, and I was watching fuel canisters drift past a viewport that had been assigned to make us feel small. My comm vibrated once on the table. 3 words: no sender, no explanation. Ashen Gate authorized, go. I read them a second time, then I set the comm face down on the table and looked at the viewport and breathed in and out once slowly, the way I had been taught to process significant information without visibly reacting to it. Far beyond the edge of this system, past the outer relay markers and the survey lanes in every corridor that the Cathali Interstellar Compact believed it knew and controlled, something was moving, something built in silence, something that the galaxy had been confidently told did not exist, something we had spent 20 years constructing in the outermost dark of our own solar system, piece by piece, system by system, with a patience that had cost everyone involved more than they had expected when they signed on. I sent one character back through the mass channel, confirmed, then I put the comm in my jacket pocket and went to my bunk because tomorrow I needed to be composed and sharp and completely steady, and I had always been better at that when I started from a full night of sleep. It was not calm. Calm is something you feel. What I had was a decision I had made a long time ago and chosen again every day since, and it did not require feeling anything in particular to hold. I stared at the ceiling. The station's environmental systems hummed their single low note. The lights cycled down to their night setting, and the lounge outside went dark, and the fuel canisters kept moving on their rails beyond the glass, steady and mechanical and completely indifferent to what was coming. I closed my eyes when the morning came. Everything was going to change, not with fire, not with ultimatums, with 3 words and a sealed message, and the steady hands of a crew that had spent years preparing for a day exactly like this one. I slept outside. The canisters drifted past in their arcs. The magnetic rail system never paused, never hesitated, never considered what it was moving or why. That was the thing about machinery. It did not need to understand its purpose to serve it. People were different. People needed to know why they were doing a thing before they could do it well, and everyone on the Resolute Dawn had known why for a long time. They had signed on to a mission with no date and no guaranteed outcome, and they had stayed. That meant something. It meant everything, actually. Tomorrow I was going to walk into a room and represent all of them, and I was going to do it the right way. I had been told once by a very old retired diplomat, whose name I no longer used out loud, because using it would be a security breach, that the most dangerous thing negotiator could carry into a room was eagerness. Eagerness made you readable. Eagerness made you predictable. The diplomat who comes to the table wanting something is already disadvantaged, because the other party knows exactly which lever to press, but the diplomat who comes to the table having already done the thing that makes the want unnecessary, who comes to the table from a position of completeness rather than need, that diplomat is operating in a different space entirely. Tomorrow I would walk into the partnership discussion as a representative of a civilization that had spent 20 years becoming complete. They were going to present us with a document designed to manage us. We had brought a different kind of document. I slept. Owen Drake knocked on my cabin door at 04:15. Station time. I was already sitting up. When the knock came, I had been lying awake for 20 minutes, not from nerves, but from the particular alertness that arrives before significant events. Whether you invited or not, my body had decided the night was over before the lights agreed. Long-range passive array. Owen said through the door. Dan and LT Unk and GT Wise. Pulling it up now. I was dressed and in the corridor before he finished the sentence. The Resolute Dawn's command center was small, 3 stations, 1 comms terminal, a central display that could be configured for navigation or tactical or sensor feed. Danny Ford had the display set to the passive array output, which showed the system around Verath station in a false color render that translated signal density into visible light, standard traffic fill. The inner system lanes in soft orange threads. The outer system was empty. Almost there, Danny said, pointing to the far edge of the display, a cluster of readings, faint and multiple, appearing at the system's outer relay coordinate. Started approximately 6 minutes ago. Still incoming. I watched the cluster grow. Each new contact added another point of light to the outer edge of the display. The points were too small to resolve into hull types yet. They were just presences, just signals, just the mathematical fact that something was there that had not been there before. I had known this was coming. I had sent the confirmation the night before and understood what it authorized, but knowing a thing is coming and watching it arrive are different experiences, and standing in that command center, watching those contacts multiply on the display, I understood for the first time, in a visceral way, exactly how much work had been done by people I had never met, in places I had rarely visited, across a timeline that had stretched longer than I had been in active service. Let me tell you what we had built. 53 years after Dr. Lena Forsythe refused to accept her field's consensus about what a particular set of equations meant and spent 11 years proving them wrong. Humanity had faster than light travel. It was not elegant at first. The early drives were enormous, fuel-hungry, and marginally reliable, but they worked. And within a generation they had improved enough to make interstellar distances navigable. We went to the nearest systems. We found no other life. We went further. We found plenty. The Catholi Interstellar Compact was not the first alien civilization we encountered, but it was the largest and the most consequential. The first contact happened 18 light-years from Earth when an exploratory vessel called the Meridian Dawn encountered a Catholi border patrol, and the 2 ships spent 47 hours at close range attempting to communicate before anyone on either side successfully established a translation baseline. What the Catholi crew Communicated once communication was possible was essentially a welcome note and a set of coordinates. Report to Verath Station. The compact will receive you. Earth's first delegation did exactly that. They went, they were received, and they came home with the compact standard membership offer. The council debated for 3 years and could not reach consensus on whether to accept. Director Caroline Hale was the one who broke the deadlock, and she broke it by reframing the question. She told the council that the debate they were having was about whether the compact's terms were acceptable, but the correct question was whether Earth had any alternative to those terms. If they signed now, they would be classified as a managed dependency with the appearance of membership. If they asked for more time, they would eventually sign as a managed dependency with the appearance of membership, unless they used the time to become something else entirely. She proposed becoming something else entirely. The vote was close. Implementation was not glamorous. Project Ashengate, the name that existed only in sealed files for 20 years, was not a single program. It was dozens of overlapping programs funded through rerouted infrastructure appropriations and classified research budgets staffed by people who signed agreements that required them to not discuss their work with anyone who did not already know about it. Building something in the outer asteroid belt of our own solar system that had never been built before. I was recruited at 28 by Commander Bridge Malone, who sat across a desk from me in a room I was told to forget, and said, "We are not trying to build what they Kasali have. If we build what they have, we will always be behind them. We are trying to build something they have not imagined." She was right about the strategy. The engineering teams took that mandate seriously in ways that produced arguments lasting years. Propulsion Group refused to base their work on Catherley fold drive schematics and spent 4 years developing a fundamentally different approach that our physicists eventually called voidfold shielding. The principle was different enough from standard FTL theory that when I tried to explain it to Clara Webb on her first day in the program, she asked me 3 times if I was describing the same effect using a different model or actually describing a different effect. It was a different effect. The ship did not move through space. The ship held its position while local space was reorganized around it. The result was faster transit with a sensor signature so small that Catherley passive arrays could not distinguish it from background thermal noise. The whole design required another 4 years of what I can only describe as principled argument. Every known spacefaring species, the Cathali included, built ships according to the same underlying logic. You move through space, so you shape your hull to move through space efficiently. Smooth curves, low resistance profiles, designs that looked purposeful and coherent and could be correctly identified from a distance as what they were. Our engineers proposed the opposite. They proposed that the whole should be designed not around the physics of movement but around the psychology of perception. What does a ship need to look like to immediately communicate to any observer of any species that they are looking at something outside their existing categories? The answer they arrived at was angular, layered, structured in ways that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, so that in any lighting condition the ship appeared less like an object and more like an absence, like a shape cut out of the visible universe. one of the materials scientists called the final hull alloy light negative, which was not technically accurate but became the term everyone used. Weapon systems took 6 years and produced the most sustained disagreement in the program's history. The core debate was philosophical rather than technical. The ballistics team wanted systems optimized for maximum yield. Program's civilian oversight group wanted systems optimized for demonstration and deterrence. The final design was the kinetic relativistic lance, which was capable of extraordinary precision at extreme range and was calibrated not to maximize destruction but to maximize the certainty of the target that destruction was available if chosen. A weapon designed to prevent its own use by making the cost of forcing that use clear. The command network was the last major system and the one I understood best, having spent 4 years working on its architecture. The Catholic command structure, like every known military command structure, operated through hierarchical delegation from a central command point. Cut the command point, disrupt the fleet. Our distributed neural command network had no central point. It had Fleet Commander Dale Orarin, who communicated intentions rather than orders, and 312 ships that received those intentions simultaneously and translated them into coordinated action at speeds that no sequential command system could match. There was no flagship to target, there was no bridge to disable, there was only the network, distributed and self-correcting and completely unlike anything in any known military registry. 312 ships, the final count, assembled across 12 separate construction platforms in the outer belt, crewed and armed and equipped in, kept in deep system holding positions for the past 8 months while the diplomatic mission was assembled and launched. Dale had been running the fleet through daily readiness exercises for 4 months. The crews knew their mission. They had been waiting in silence, running cold, communicating only through the masked channels that looked like background static to external scanners. I had authorized their movement 16 hours ago with 3 words forwarded through a chain of masked relays that terminated in a signal my personal comm received as if it had originated from a nearby civilian ship. Ashen Gate authorized go. On the display in front of me, the contacts at the outer relay continued to multiply. Danny had switched to the long-range optical feed when the sensor array refined its readings enough to provide a whole shape estimate. The shapes were wrong. That was the first thing you noticed even before the numbers. The shapes were wrong in a way that no Catholic catalog entry matched, because there were no catalog entries for what you were looking at, angular and dark and layered, appearing at the outer edge of the system in a slow and deliberate tide that had no interest in speed because it had no need for it. Owen was standing beside me. He had not said anything since waking me. He was watching the display with both hands at his sides and his face doing the thing it did when he was working very hard to maintain a professional expression while something inside him was taking inventory of the situation at a rapid pace. How many so far? I asked Danny. Check the counter. 241 confirmed. Contacts more still resolving. I nodded. Yara, Owen said he never used my first name on duty. I turned to look at him. His expression had shifted past professional into something genuinely open, which was rare for him. Are you all right? I thought about the question. For a moment because it deserved an honest answer. Ask me again in 12 hours, I said. He nodded and looked back at the display. 260. 270. The optical feed was beginning to resolve the Warden-class platforms at the formation's outer edge, 4 of them each larger than Vareth Station itself. The station's own passive sensors would have picked up the context by now. Every alert in the Cathali monitoring network would be live. The Grand Fleet, anchored 300 km from the station's eastern face, would have its own array feeds running. In 6 hours, I was due in the diplomatic hall. I had a lot to do before then, and none of it involved panicking, so I straightened my jacket, told Danny to keep the feed running and flag any change in the formation or any active sensor query from the Catholic side, and when I get breakfast, some situations call for drama, some call for coffee. The ones that are going to resolve themselves through the quality of your thinking rather than the speed of your reactions call for both in that order. I had 312 ships and a proposal and one shot at changing the shape of the next century. I was going to eat breakfast first. 312. The final count resolved on the display while I was still holding my coffee. Danny called it out quietly from across the command center, his voice doing the careful flat thing that people's voices do when they have registered something enormous and are choosing to describe it in a tone several sizes smaller than the thing itself deserves. I set the coffee down and walked back to the display. 312. Contacts at the outer relay point. Full optical resolution. Now the formation was perfect, not perfect in the way that a rehearsed parade is perfect, where the perfection is the point and the performance is the message. Perfect in the way that a tide is perfect, each element doing exactly what it was designed to do in exactly the position it was assigned without any awareness. That perfection might impress anyone. The fleet did not care whether it impressed anyone. That was the point. I had spent 12 years inside Project Ashen Gate, 6 of them working directly on hull design and sensor masking with the team at the Outer Belt's 3rd construction platform. I had seen these ships built from the first frame section to the final systems check. I had run maintenance inspections and crew briefings and emergency drills in corridors I had watched welded together. 2 years earlier, I knew every class of vessel in that formation by its silhouette and by the way its thruster geometry appeared on a passive sensor return, but seeing them on a display arranged in formation, all 312 of them holding position at the edge of this system, while Vareth Station's own sensor array tried and failed to find them in any catalog. I understood for the first time what they would look like to someone who did not know what they were looking at. They would look like a mistake, a sensor error, a hallucination produced by an array that had developed a fault, and then the optical feed would resolve and the shapes would sharpen and the mistake would become real, and the real would be something that no one in that sensor room had a language for. They would look like a question humanity had been holding for 20 years, finally spoken out loud. I turned from the display. I had 40 minutes before I needed to begin preparing for the session. I used 30 of them going through my briefing notes for the 3rd time. Not because I did not know them, but because the act of reviewing them was a form of controlled focus that I had developed over years as a tool for moving from one state of mind to Another. The morning had been the state of watching something enormous arrive. The session would require a different state, entirely calm, present, interested in the room rather than the situation behind it, capable of asking question 13 of my prepared 17 without giving any indication that I knew exactly where question 17 was going to land. The diplomatic session was scheduled to begin at the 3rd hour of station day. I arrived 7 minutes early. Danny confirmed as I was putting on my dress jacket that the Cathali station communication network had shown a significant increase in internal traffic volume approximately 40 minutes after the contacts first appeared on the outer relay. He could not decrypt the traffic, but the volume pattern suggested a simultaneous series of alerts moving up a chain of command. He also confirmed that the Cathali Grand Fleet had shifted from passive to active sensor mode at approximately the same time, which meant they were looking at the formation with everything they had. Everything they had was very good. It would not match anything in their catalogs. I walked to the diplomatic hall alone. The diplomatic hall was designed to make you feel small and to do it so elegantly that you would thank someone for the experience. 40 m of ceiling supported by columns of pale composite that caught the station's light and distributed it in long measured angles across a floor of polished gray stone. The central table was a single fabricated surface 32 m long, surrounded by chairs that accommodated 17 different physical configurations because the compact's membership crossed 17 categories of body plan. Cathali attendants moved along the walls in patterns that looked casual and were not. Environmental controls, translation feeds, monitoring systems, all of it running quietly and continuously and professionally in a room that had hosted 300 years of exactly this kind of conversation and had produced exactly the outcomes it was designed to produce. Grand Admiral VTH Cal of the Cathali Interstellar Compact was at the far end of the table. When I entered, I had studied his file. For 4 months, he was 2 m of controlled authority. His chromatophores, cycling through a slow, deliberate gold gray that his physiological profile indicated he used in formal situations where he wanted to project certainty. Without aggression, he wore no rank insignia. He had passed the point of needing them. The room knew who he was. He looked at me the moment I walked in. Not a glance, a look. He had been briefed on the human delegation and had made whatever calculation he was going to make about us, and the look was the expression of someone who has completed their assessment and is now engaged in the formality of beginning the proceedings. I met the look without expression and walked to my assigned seat. My delegation filled in around me. Owen on my left, Priya across from him, Clara and Danny down the table with the junior staff behind them. We were a smaller group than every other delegation in the room. That was intentional on the Catholic side. It communicated scale. It said, look at how few of you there are now. Look at how many of us have gathered. I sat down and opened my briefing folder and noted the positions of the 4 monitoring stations along the walls, the translation relay posts, and the 2 doorways at the far end of the hall that I had not seen in the briefing documents. I filed all of it without appearing to look at anything except the folder. VTH Cal spoke first. His translation collar was set to the diplomatic formal register, which made his voice measured and precise and entirely unrevealing. Commander Voss. The Cathali Interstellar Compact welcomes Earth's delegation to this partnership discussion. We are pleased to offer Earth the opportunity to join a community of civilizations that has maintained stability, commerce, and mutual protection across this region of space for 3 centuries. Our framework has been successful. Our offer is genuine. I smiled. It was the smile I had been practicing for 4 months. It conveyed respect and interest and the complete absence of any urgent concern. Grand Admiral, thank you for your welcome. Earth's Council is deeply appreciative of the Compact's history and of the opportunity to discuss a future relationship. The session began. Trade negotiators presented the membership framework. He was methodical and thorough and had clearly given this presentation many times, which meant he had learned to read the room's reactions and calibrate his pacing accordingly. I gave him nothing to calibrate from. I listened. I took notes. I asked clarifying questions on points where the implications were largest and the language was most deliberately ambiguous. Velen answered each question smoothly and moved on. Owen was keeping a running note count on his pad. He had the handwriting of someone who had trained themselves to write without looking at the page, so that he could appear to be looking at the speaker while recording everything. I noticed peripherally that he had underlined something 3 times on page 2 and then drawn a small line through the underlining. That was his notation for something that had appeared contradictory and then resolved itself as intentional. He was reading the same document I was reading. The Orani Ambassador Council Adim was seated 2 positions to my left. He had the compact, watchful posture of someone who has been in rooms like this many times and stopped being impressed by them long time ago. He glanced in my direction twice during the first 40 minutes. I did not acknowledge either glance. I would have time to speak with him in the recess. At 38 minutes into the presentation, I noticed the first change in the room. Catholic attendants do not stop moving. That is a cultural and professional characteristic. They are trained to maintain continuous calm activity during sessions because stillness draws attention and attention disrupts proceedings. But the attendant at the monitoring station near the east wall had stopped moving, not paused. Stopped. His hand was against his communication earpiece and he was looking at a secondary display panel that had not been active when I entered the room. I kept my eyes on Velson. I wrote a note on my pad. I waited. 2 more attendants had stopped by the time I reached question 11. Communications traffic that Danny had flagged this morning was moving again, and some portion of it had reached people in this room. I finished question 11. I looked at my notes as though consulting them for question 12. In my peripheral vision, I watched breath calls aid cross the room in a path that was designed to look purposeful but brought him within speaking distance of the Admiral. The aide leaned down and said something in a register too low for the translation collar to carry across the table. Breath calls chromatographer shifted a single brief cycle through pale blue white before returning to gold gray. The physiological literature I had read described that color transition as the Catholic equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. I asked question 12, which was about corridor fee structures. Admiral. The aide had straightened and was now speaking at a volume the room could hear. The long-range display. It requires your attention. The main display screens along the upper wall, which had been showing a standard navigation chart of the system during the presentation, flickered once. Then they switched to the live feed from the station's passive sensor array. Velson stopped mid-sentence. Every face in the room turned to the screens. I kept my eyes on the screens for exactly 2 seconds. I had already seen this feed this morning in the Resolute Dawn's command center. I knew what was on it. 2 seconds was enough time to register the reaction of the room before I shifted my attention to the thing I was actually there to watch, which was Breath Call, the Grand Admiral of the Catholic Interstellar Compact, was looking at the display with the expression of someone who has been doing a calculation for 3 decades and has just encountered a variable that the calculation did not account for. His chromatophores were cycling through colors that the physiological literature described as involuntary. The controlled gold gray was gone. In its place was something shifting and rapid and completely unmanaged, the chromatic equivalent of a face that has forgotten it was being watched. On the screens, the formation was fully visible now. 312 contacts at the outer relay point, the first of them now close enough for the optical array to resolve into recognizable hull shapes, not shapes that matched any Catholic catalog, not shapes that matched any known independent fleet registry. Dark, angular, layered, built to a design principle that no existing entry in any database of spacefaring civilizations had ever described, because the design principle had been invented in secret in the outer asteroid belt of a solar system that the Cathol considered, categorized and contained, and essentially resolved. The contact counter in the upper right corner of the display had stopped incrementing. 312 was the final number. The room was completely silent. I do not mean quiet. I mean silent in the specific way that a large space goes silent when every person in it has simultaneously run out of words. Velen had his briefing document open in front of him and was not looking at it. The 2 junior Catholic officers near the monitoring station were looking at each other in a way that communicated the sharing of an experience too large for individual processing. The Iranian ambassador, Council Adin, had both hands flat on the table surface and was looking at the display with an expression I had not anticipated and could not immediately categorize. It was not fear. It was not surprise in the ordinary sense of the word. It was closer to the expression of someone watching something arrive that they had been privately, carefully, almost secretly hoping for a very long time. The Sulkai delegate envoy Luke had sat back in his chair and was saying something under his breath in Sulkai that his translation collar was either not configured to render or was rendering into something that did not transmit. The vet representative, Speaker Rail, was watching the display with both her secondary eyes open, which the briefing notes had described as a VETH response to situations of high perceptual importance. The Vice Admiral, who had been standing against the rear wall, said something in Catholic. His translation collar rendered it in the flat, neutral voice that callers always use regardless of the weight of what they are carrying. Humans don't have ships like that. The words occupied the room the way a sound occupies a space, After the instrument stops playing. Present and then slowly no longer. Present but leaving something in the air. Where they had been, I let 5 seconds pass. I counted them internally at a deliberate pace that matched the rhythm of someone breathing steadily rather than waiting tensely. 5 seconds is a very long time in a room that is completely silent. Then I looked at Grand Admiral Vrethkal. He was already looking at me. His chromatophores had not returned to the controlled gold gray. They were still cycling slower now, but not controlled. His expression, to whatever extent the Cathali face communicates expression, was the face of a man who had built a model of the world and has just found that the model was wrong in a way he did not know was possible. I spoke in a normal, conversational register without raising my voice, without any dramatic inflection in the tone I might use to make a point about a clause in a trade agreement we didn't. I said, then your timeline gave us 20 years to disagree with ourselves about it. I reached into my briefing folder. I produced a document that was not the one I had been handed this morning. It was a different document entirely, one I had carried from Earth in a sealed case and had not shown to anyone outside my immediate team until this moment. I slid it to the center of the table, equidistant from every position around it. When you are ready to continue, I said, we have some thoughts on the arrangement we would prefer. No one reached for the document. The screens continued to show the sensor feed. The sensor feed continued to show 312 ships that should not exist, doing exactly nothing, holding their formation with the absolute patience of things built by people who understood that the most powerful thing you can do in the moment, when everything is changed, is not move. I folded my hands on the table and waited. 5 minutes passed. Nobody spoke. The attendants along the walls had abandoned any pretense of moving. Velson had closed his briefing folder and set it to one side, which told me that he had understood the session was no longer about what was in that folder. One of the junior Cathali officers had run a cross-reference query on the secondary display I could see reflected in the viewport glass behind him. The query returned empty. He ran it again, empty. Again, he ran it a third time with expanded parameters and got the same result, because there was nothing in any database to match against what we had built. Was not a variant of anything known. That had been the point. I watched Vrethkal during those 5 minutes, the way you watch a face when the stakes are high and the expression is the only information available. His chromatophores were doing something I had not seen in any of the physiological reference materials I had spent 4 months studying. The cycling had slowed to a pace that the literature associated with deep concentration, but the colors were wrong, not the colors associated with the categories the literature described. Something intermediate, something that fell between the labeled states the researchers had documented, occupying a gap in the taxonomy, the way discoveries do when reality generates something that the vocabulary has not yet caught up to. He was feeling something that the Catholic language of color had not been fully designed for. I thought not for the first time about Director Caroline Hale. She had told me once in the last year of her life, when I visited her in the hospital in Edinburgh, where she was doing the slow work of finishing that the thing she was most uncertain about was not whether the fleet would be built, or whether the timing would work, or whether the proposal would be accepted. The thing she was most uncertain about was what the people on the other side of the table would feel when the moment arrived. She had spent 20 years thinking about the structures and the strategies and the systems, but she kept returning to the question of what it would be like to be breath in that moment, looking at something that invalidated 3 centuries of certainty, and whether the feeling would be one that could be worked with. She had decided that it could. She had argued in the final version of the program's rationale document that beings capable of building a 300-year interstellar governance structure are by definition capable of updating their models of the world. The update might be uncomfortable. The update might be resisted initially, but the cognitive architecture that made the compact possible was the same cognitive architecture that would eventually process what it was looking at and understand that the world was different from what it had been, and that different did not necessarily mean worse. I believe she was right. I had always believed she was right. But I was watching Breath Cow's face in real time and understanding that belief and experience are different, and that this particular experience was going to take a moment to process, regardless of how correct the analysis had been. The aide leaned down to Vrethel again and spoke something low and urgent. Brethel raised one hand in the gesture that the Cathali used to indicate, "Not now, please." The aide straightened and remained standing at the Admiral's shoulder, which was the aide's way of communicating that "not now" could not last too much longer. Speaker rail of the V moved first, not dramatically. She shifted in her chair, redirecting her posture from the display to the table, and then she looked at me. It was a direct look held for approximately 3 seconds that communicated more than 3 seconds of eye contact normally can. It communicated that she had been in the compact for 91 years, that her world had signed the standard agreement when she was young enough, that she had no memory of its terms being debated, that she had spent the decades since in a structure whose shape she understood very well, and that she was watching the shape change in real time and was not afraid of what came after. I gave her a small single nod. She returned it. Breath Kale spoke at the 7-minute mark. He had gotten his chromatophores back to something approaching the controlled gold gray. His voice, when it came, was measured and deliberate, the voice of a man who has decided that the situation requires the most professional version of himself and has summoned that version. Commander Voss, the presence of an unregistered fleet formation within compact monitored space is a matter of significant concern. Under our corridor protocols, I want to understand what we are looking at before we proceed further. It was the right opening move, not aggressive, not capitulating, asking for information, which was the most defensible position available and also the most honest one, because he genuinely did not know what he was looking at. I could work with that, Grand Admiral. I said, we are looking at Earth's fleet built over the past 20 years in our outer solar system. 312 vessels, crewed and armed, and currently holding a static formation at your system's outer relay point. They are not moving toward the station. They have made no communications. Their weapons are not active. They are simply present. A pause in the purpose of their presence here. I gestured toward the document in the center of the table. Context, I said, for the conversation we are about to have. Breath Kale looked At the document, he looked at me. His aide was still standing at his shoulder. The monitoring stations were still lit. Along the walls, the display behind him was still showing 312 ships at the outer relay holding position with the patience of something that has no reason to move, because it has already arrived. That document, I said, is Earth's proposal for the arrangement between our civilization and the compact, not the compact's proposal for Earth, ours. We would very much like to discuss it. The room was still silent, but it was a different kind of silence than it had been 5 minutes ago. It was the silence of people who have processed the first shock and are now beginning to do the harder and more important work of thinking. I waited for it. I had time. I had all the time I needed, and the fleet outside was not going anywhere. The document sat in the center of the table for 11 minutes before anyone reached for it. I know the exact time because Owen, sitting to my left with his notepad, had written the time stamp when I placed it on the table and would write another when someone finally moved to pick it up. Owen documented everything. It was the quality that it made me request him specifically for this mission over 2 other candidates. Some people document because they are told to. Owen documented because he understood that moments acquire their full meaning in retrospect, and retrospect requires a record. It was Brethkel's trade negotiators who picked it up first, not the admiral himself. Velen took it carefully, the way you handle a thing whose contents you already know will require careful handling, and began reading from the first page with the expression of a professional engaging with a working document. His chromatophores, which had been running a rapid and largely uncontrolled pattern since the display had switched to the sensor feed, began to slow and steady as he read whatever he was feeling. The act of processing text was calming him. That was useful information about what kind of person he was. Brethil let's read for approximately 90 seconds. Then he held out one hand, and Velson gave him the document. The Grand Admiral read in silence for 4 minutes. I watched his face. His chromatophores had returned to the controlled gold gray, and his expression was as unreadable as he could make it. But there were 2 places in the document where his pace slowed almost imperceptibly, and I noted both of them. One was on the second page where the proposed council representation formula appeared. One was on the 4th page where the corridor access provisions were laid out. Both were the sections I had expected to produce the most sustained negotiation. He set the document down. This is not a membership agreement, he said. No, I agreed. It is a partnership framework. There is a meaningful difference. You are proposing modifications to the compact's governing council structure. We are proposing that the governing council structure accurately reflect the membership it represents. I said currently it does not. We have documented this in the appendix. A pause. He had not looked at the appendix yet. He was taking in the shape of the proposal before engaging with its specifics, which was the correct approach, and told me that whatever he was feeling in this moment, his thinking was still operational. You are proposing equal corridor access for all member species, he said. We are proposing corridor access weighted by contribution and need rather than by historical allocation. I said the distinction matters. We are not asking for equal treatment. We are asking for fair treatment, and we have included a Formula for calculating what fair treatment would look like given current resource distributions. Breath Kale looked at me for a moment, then he looked at the fleet on the display, then he looked back at me. I understood what that look was asking. It was asking whether the fleet outside was a threat, whether the proposal on the table was backed by the implicit message that refusing it would mean dealing with those ships. I answered the unasked question. Grand Admiral, the fleet you are looking at was not built to threaten anyone. We did not bring it here to stand behind us like a weapon. We brought it here because the most honest thing we could do after 20 years of working toward a different kind of relationship was show you that those 20 years were real. The fleet is evidence, not leverage, evidence that Earth took this seriously, evidence that we are not a small new civilization asking for what a small new civilization can ask for. We are something else, and we would like to talk about what that something else means for both of us. The silence that followed was different from the one after the display switched. That one had been shock. This one was consideration. Counsel Adin, the Iranian ambassador, spoke for the first time. Grand Admiral. His voice was careful and precise, and had the particular quality of words that have been prepared. The Irani delegation requests formal recognition under the Compact Charter's Article 17, which provides for member species input when a session touches directly on the terms of the Compact's membership framework. Brethkel turned to look at him. We have been members of the Compact for 60 years. Aiden said the framework being discussed is not only Earth's framework, it is ours as well. We have interest in this conversation. V. Thals. Aide had returned to his shoulder, speaking low and urgent. The Admiral listened. He responded in Cathali at a volume the translation callers were not configured to render. Then he looked back at Aiden and said, recognized. It was a significant word. It meant the session had changed scope. It meant the Irani had made a formal request and the Grand Admiral had accepted it rather than rejecting it, which told me something important about where Vrek was in his calculations. He was already working toward an outcome that was not what he had planned for this morning. He did not know what shape that outcome would take. Yet, he was gathering information and keeping options open, which was what an intelligent person does when the situation has moved past their prepared position. Speaker Rail requested recognition next, then Envoy Luke of the Sulkai Brethkal granted both. By the time he had done so, 5 member species were formally on record as having interest in this conversation, and the session that had been planned as a bilateral processing of Earth's membership application had become something else entirely, something that the Grand Admiral had not scheduled and had not expected and was now managing in real time. He called a recess. I used the recess to do 2 things. The first was to send a brief status note to Dale Oren through the masked channel. The note said simply, proceeding hold. Position weapons cold. He would understand the rest. Dale had been at the outer relay with the fleet for 16 hours. He was patient by disposition and by training. He would hold. The second thing I did was walk to where Counsel Adin was standing near the corridor entrance and say without preamble, "Thank you." Adin looked at me with the expression of someone who has done a thing at significant personal cost and is not interested in being thanked for It as a way of having the cost minimized. We have been waiting 60 years for someone to put that document on the table. He said the least we could do was make sure it stayed there. He walked back into the hall before I could respond. Owen was at my shoulder. 60 years, he said quietly. Yes, they have been waiting that long, not sitting still waiting, I said, moving carefully, staying within the structure while staying ready for the moment the structure became renegotiable. I looked at the door Addie had gone through. That takes a different kind of courage than building a fleet. Owen was quiet for a moment. Does it? Building a fleet is dangerous and difficult, I said. Staying inside a system that you know is wrong, maintaining your position within it, keeping your civilization functional and your people fed and your relationships intact while holding on to the possibility that someday the situation might change, and being prepared to act when it does. That takes a different set of muscles, not lesser ones. He nodded and said nothing more. The recess lasted 22 minutes. When the session resumed, Brethel had reorganized the seating at the table, which was a significant move. He had placed representatives from the Orani, VTH, and Sulkai delegations in chairs adjacent to the main negotiating positions. They were not equal participants yet, but they were present formally on the record. He opened the resumed session with a question I had not anticipated. Commander Voss, what does Earth want from this conversation that Earth does not already have? I looked at him for a moment. What we have, I said, is 312 ships and the ability to be a problem for the compact indefinitely if we choose. What we want is to not be a problem. What we want is a genuine partnership between our civilization and every other civilization in this region, administered by a structure that actually represents them. We are not here to take. We built a fleet because we needed to be taken seriously in this room. We brought a proposal because being taken seriously was never the point. The point was always the proposal. Verkia looked at the document. Again, we will need to discuss the council representation formula, he said. I expected that, I said. In the corridor access provisions will require significant technical analysis. We have prepared detailed technical appendices. Our navigation chief is available to walk through them at whatever depth is useful. A pause. His chromatophores had settled into a color I had not seen before in the literature, a deep, steady amber gold that had the quality of something deliberate rather than reactive. He was choosing this color. He was choosing what it meant. That was, I thought, the most encouraging thing I had seen since walking into this room. We will continue, he said, and we did. The discussion that followed was unlike anything I had been trained to conduct, and unlike anything I suspect Kyle had been trained to navigate. It was not a negotiation in the sense that the word usually carries. A negotiation implies two parties with fixed positions moving toward a compromise that neither fully wants. What happened in the hours after VHL said we will continue was different. It was a conversation between people who had agreed, however, reluctantly on one side, that the thing they were building together was worth building correctly. Brethel asked questions, real ones, not the strategic questions that experienced diplomats asked to slow a process or find weaknesses, questions that revealed what he did not understand and wanted to. He asked about the construction timeline and how Earth had concealed it. I told him because there was no longer any reason not to. He asked about the voidful drive technology and whether Earth was prepared to share the underlying physics. I told him we were prepared to discuss it in the context of the larger partnership framework because technology transfers without institutional trust have historically produced instability. He accepted that framing without argument, which told me he had thought about it himself. Clara Webb walked Velen through the corridor. Access appendix for 90 minutes in a side session. I could hear Clara's voice occasionally through the open door, precise and patient, answering technical questions from a negotiator who had stopped trying to find objections and started trying to understand. When they returned to the main table, Velen had 4 pages of handwritten notes and the expression of someone who has discovered that a problem they expected to be intractable is actually solvable with the right formula. Counsel adding requested permission to submit formal Iranian commentary on the council representation section. Breath Kyle granted it. Speaker Rail asked that her commentary be entered alongside the Irani's. Breath Kyle granted that as well. By mid-afternoon, the document in the center of the table was covered in notations from 7 different parties, and it had begun to look less like a proposal and more like a working draft. I had been in diplomatic sessions that looked like that before. They were the sessions that produced outcomes. The most significant exchange of the afternoon happened at the 4th hour of the resumed session when Breathcall sat down his pen and said something that I had not prepared a response for. Commander Voss, I want to ask you something outside the formal record. I looked at his aide. His aide looked at the translation monitor. The official session log was still running. I would prefer to speak with you privately. Breath Kale said. We moved to a side chamber off the main hall. No aides, no translation monitors, just Breath Kale's personal collar and mine, and 2 chairs at a small table, and the sound of the environmental systems doing their quiet work. He sat across from me and looked at me for a moment before speaking. His chromatophores were still in the amber gold he had chosen at the table. It suited him better than the formal gold. Gray, the proposal you brought, he said. How long have you been writing it? The current version has been in development for 6 years. I said. The underlying philosophy goes back to the beginning of Project Ashengate, before the fleet existed, long before. He was quiet for a moment. You built the fleet because you needed to be taken seriously. You wrote the proposal because being taken seriously was not the point. He had used my words back at me. I was not sure whether that was conscious or not. Yes, I said, I have been managing new civilizations for 31 years. He said, I have sat in this hall, or halls like it, with the representatives of 14 species. Every one of them came to the table wanting something that the compact could give them: trade, access, protection, recognition. They came as smaller parties seeking entrance to a larger structure. Even the ones who argued about the terms came arguing about which version of the standard arrangement they would accept. He paused. You are the first delegation that came to the table, having already become something that does not need the compact. We did not come to displace the compact. I said. I know that. He said. I understood it when I read the proposal. If you had come to displace us, you would have sent the fleet before the diplomats. The fleet would have arrived first and the diplomats would have arrived after with demands. He looked at me steadily. You send the diplomats first. We sent the diplomats first, I confirmed. Why? I thought about Caroline Hale in her hospital room, making a point she had made many times in her career about the difference between power and use of power and what distinguishes one from the other, because the goal was never the fleet. I said the fleet was the evidence that we were serious about the goal. Goal was a structure in this region of space that works for every civilization. In it, that goal requires cooperation. Cooperation requires the other party to believe you want to cooperate. Arriving with 300 ships and a list of demands is not how you build that belief. Breath. Call was quiet for a long time. The compact has not always been what it should be, he said at last. Not an apology, a fact stated with the precision of someone who has thought about it and decided that honesty is the only productive path. We know, I said. That is in the proposal as well. The historical record section. I read it. I assumed you had a pause. The council representation formula will require substantial renegotiation with member worlds. This is not a decision I can make at this table. We are not asking for a decision at this table. I said we are asking for the beginning of a process that leads to one. That is what the 30-day framework in Section 9 is for. He looked at me for another moment. Then he stood and I stood, and he extended one of his secondary hands toward me in the Catholic gesture that their physiological literature described as reserved for situations of genuine mutual respect between parties of equal standing. I took it. We walked back into the main hall. The session continued. The document in the center of the table continued to accumulate notations from 7 different parties. The fleet at the outer relay continued to hold its position, cold and still and enormous, neither threatening nor retreating, simply there. By the time the session formally closed for the day, 3 things had happened. Vurath had agreed to submit Earth's proposal to the full Compact Council for formal review rather than processing it through the standard bilateral membership track. He had agreed to a joint working session involving Earth Catholic and representatives from interested member species scheduled for the following week, and he had in the final 10 minutes of the session looked at Owen Drake and asked about the technical specifications of the voidful drive, not for strategic reasons, but because he said the physics of it had been bothering him since the morning. Owen answered the question for 20 minutes and would have continued for longer. Brethkel asked follow-up questions that were genuinely curious. The session that had been planned as the processing of a small new civilization membership application ended with 2 people discussing the geometry of space at a shared table with a document between them that no one had drafted and no one had fully written yet, that I thought was how it was supposed to go. The observation deck of the Resolute Order was the highest point on the largest ship in the fleet, and standing on it felt like standing on the edge of a claim. I had been on the ship twice before this night, both times during construction inspections at the outer belt platform. When I had walked its corridors, then it smelled of welding, compounded new alloy, and the particular dry cold of a space not yet pressurized for long-term habitation. It had felt enormous and unfinished, which it was now. It smelled of people who had lived inside it for months. The accumulated presence of a crew that had made it theirs, and the corridors were warm and lit and worn in the small ways that corridors get worn when they are used every day by people who move through them without thinking. Fleet Commander Dale Oren was at the viewport when I arrived. He had his arms crossed and was looking out at Vareth Station, which, from this angle, filled the center of the view in a way that made it appear simultaneously closer and more comprehensible than it had from the Resolute Dawn's small forward port. The Catholic Grand Fleet was visible at the edge of the frame, its formation transformed from the morning's deliberate display arrangement into something quieter and more procedural. Waiting, not preparing, Dale heard me come in and turned. He was shorter than his voice on comm channel suggested. Compact and precisely organized man with gray beginning to show at his temples, and the expression of someone who has been running a controlled situation for 16 hours and has very recently been told the situation produced the outcome they hoped for. Yara, he said. He had known me long enough that we did not require anything more than that to begin. I came to stand beside him at the viewport outside. Vareth Station turned through its slow rotation in the amber light of its own running systems. Smaller vessels moved along its docking arms in the ordinary patterns of a working station, supply traffic, courier shuttles, the small continuous commerce of a place that does not stop because something significant has happened. Inside one of its halls, the station had been here before any of today's events. It would be here after. It was large enough and old enough to absorb significance without stopping. The formation held, I said. The formation held, he confirmed. 16 hours at static position, no contact with any external vessel, no active sensor emissions. We were pinged on standard identification frequencies approximately 200 times. Across the session, we acknowledged none of them. Good. The crew was patient. He said it with the particular quality of a fleet commander who considers his crew's patience a personal achievement, and is not wrong about that. Some of the younger officers had difficulty with the silence. They are trained for active operations. Sitting still in the dark for 16 hours is a different discipline. How did you manage it? I told them what the silence was for. He said that helped. I looked out at the station. Catholic Grand Fleet passive lights were running, no active scanning, no formation adjustments. Vreth had told his fleet commander to hold, and the fleet commander had held. And that fact, small as it seemed against the scale of everything else that had happened, was the fact I kept returning to in my thinking. A Catholic Grand Admiral had been shown 312 ships that should not exist, and had chosen to tell his fleet to stand down rather than respond. That decision had been made within the first hour of the session. It told me something about Breath Kale that no briefing file had contained, and no amount of preparation could have guaranteed. It told me he was the kind of person who, when surprised by something larger than his current model, updates the model rather than attacking the surprise. That was the person you could work with. That was the person we had needed to be in that room. Tell me about the session, Dale said. I told him. I started from the moment the display switched and went through it in the order it had happened, because Dale processed information in sequence and lost the thread when things jumped around. He listened without interrupting, which was his way. He had Always been a better listener than they. Role of fleet commander usually required, and had spent years finding ways to use that quality in a context that rewarded decisive action over patient attention. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Aiden, he said, you did not expect him, not at that specific moment. I expected him to find a way to participate in the discussion at some point. I did not expect him to invoke Article 17 in the first session before the shock had fully cleared the room. Why did he? I thought about Aiden's face when he said, we have been waiting 60 years, the expression of someone stating a fact that has been true for a very long time and is not interested in softening it because he understood that the shock was the window. I said, Freth. Call's defenses were down, his prepared positions were disrupted. The moment between the freeze and the recovery was the moment when the most things were possible, and Aiden used it. I paused. He was right. Dale nodded slowly. Outside, a supply shuttle completed its circuit of the lower docking arm and began a return pass in the private conversation. What did you take from it? That breath. Kale is genuinely troubled by what the compact has become, I said. Clears throat, not performatively. He was not telling me what he thought I needed to hear. He was telling me something he has been carrying, he said. The compact has not always been what it should be, in a tone that had a lot of weight behind it. A Catholic Grand Admiral who thinks the compact has not been what it should be. Yes, that is either very useful or a performance we have not seen through yet. It is useful, I said. I do not think it is performance. You cannot fake the particular quality of guilt that takes 30 years to develop. Dale looked at me. You could feel that in a conversation. I have had that conversation with myself, I said, about different things, but the quality of it is recognizable. He was quiet again. The viewport reflected both our faces in the glass, dimly overlaid on the station and the fleet and the stars behind them. Bridge Malone had said something to me once in one of the later years of the program, when the construction was further along and the theoretical work had shifted into engineering problems, and the weight of what we were doing had settled into the daily texture of life rather than sitting above it like a concept. She said that the thing she had not anticipated about the project was how personal it would feel, not in a sentimental way, in the way that any work feels personal when you give it enough years. The ships had stopped being a strategy and become a thing that existed with their own specific qualities and histories, and the people who built them had become people she thought about with a kind of care that was different from the care you have for colleagues. She said she hoped that it would work, not because she wanted to be right about the strategy, but because she wanted the people involved to have spent their years on something real. It had worked, not completely yet, not in the way that a signature on a finalized document would make it complete, but in the way that Director Hale had always described the goal, which was not a signature but a shift, a change in the shape of things, the beginning of a different arrangement between civilizations in this region of space, undertaken by people who had reasons not to trust each other and had chosen to try anyway. The beginning was real. The rest was work. What comes next? Dale asked specifically. Joint working session next week. Earth Catholian representatives from interested member species. I expect the Irani, VTH, and Sulkai to participate, possibly 2 others based on the contact traffic Danny has been monitoring. I paused. Council representation formula will be. The hardest point, Kale is personally willing to revise it. The political cost of actually revising it across 41 member worlds with varying relationships to the current arrangement is a different problem. How long? Months for a framework, years for full implementation. I looked at the station. But the framework matters. Once the framework exists on paper, the structure of the problem changes. You stop arguing about whether change is possible and start arguing about how fast. Dale seemed satisfied with that. He had always been better at accepting incomplete timelines than most senior officers I had served with. Most of them wanted the end point before they could commit to the path. Dale understood that some paths did not have visible end points and that the inability to see the end was not a reason to refuse the beginning. The fleet, he said. What happens to it now? It was the question I had been thinking about since the private conversation with Kale. The fleet had done its work. It had demonstrated what it was built to demonstrate, maintaining it in static formation at the outer relay for weeks or months while the working sessions proceeded would send a different message than the one we had intended. It would start to look like pressure, and leverage were not the foundation we were trying to build. I am going to propose a joint exercise framework, I said. Earth and Catholic vessels training together in the outer system, starting with a small component of the Ashengate fleet and expanding as the institutional relationship develops. The fleet does not go away, but it stops being a statement and becomes a contribution. Dale turned to look at me directly. A joint exercise framework with the Cathali and eventually with every other member species that wants to participate. I said the proposal includes a collective defense framework. The Ashengate fleet is the foundation of a shared security structure rather than a human independent capability. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the station turned the fleet held. Caroline Hale wrote that into the original proposal. He said she did. She said that a civilization that builds a fleet to demonstrate it does not need to be managed and clears throat, then keeps that fleet separate from everything around it has only solved half the problem. The other half is becoming genuinely part of a community rather than the dominant power in a neighborhood. And you believe that? I built 12 years of my life on it, I said. I am well past the point of not believing it. He looked at me with the expression he used when he was checking whether I was all right and did not want to ask directly. I had known that expression for 9 years. I am all right. I said. You look tired. I am tired. I am also all right. Both are true. He turned back to the viewport. Bridge would have like today. She would have said we moved too cautiously. He smiled. It was a brief, genuine smile that did not quite reach the professional surface of his face, but was visible if you knew where to look. She said that about everything. She was usually right. We stood at the viewport for a while without speaking. The station turned. The fleet held. The stars beyond the glass were the same stars they had always been, unchanged by the events of a single day in a diplomatic hall, unchanged by 3 centuries of Catholic governance, unchanged by the slow accumulation of civilizations reaching toward each other across distances that had once seemed absolute. They had been burning since before any of us existed and would continue burning long after the documents we wrote tonight were forgotten, but we were here now. That was the thing that the stars could not make irrelevant, whatever scale they imposed on the events of a single day. The fact of those events remained. Something had shifted today in the shape of the arrangement between civilizations in this region of space. Not completely, not permanently, but actually in the way that actual things can be built on. I thought about the 17 questions I had prepared and the 12 I had asked before the display switched. I thought about closing his briefing folder. I thought about Aiden rising from his chair with the particular posture of someone who has chosen the right moment and knows it. I thought about Breath Cal looking at me across a small table in a side chamber and saying the compact has not always been what it should be, with the weight of 30 years behind it. I thought about the people on 312 ships who had spent 16 hours in the dark running cold, not moving, waiting. I pulled out my comm and opened the channel to Dale's command network. It was the internal channel, the one that went directly to every ship in the fleet simultaneously. I had been thinking about what to say for weeks in the scattered way that you think about something when you are not sure it is going to be necessary, and then it is. What I had prepared was careful and comprehensive. What I sent was simpler than that. I typed today was real. Thank you. Rest when you can. I sent it and put the comm away. Dale looked at me sideways. That's all. That's all, I said. They know the rest. He nodded. We stood at the viewport until the station completed another segment of its rotation and the configuration of docking arms and running lights shifted into a new arrangement. The fleet remained still. The stars did not change. The work that was coming was long and complicated and would require better days than today on both sides of the table, and it would require patience on a scale that made 20 years of construction feel brief. But today had been real. The door was open, and in the morning we would proceed. We did not leave the viewport immediately. There was nothing requiring us to move, and the view was one that I understood. Standing there, I was not going to see again in quite this way. The fleet would redistribute after tonight. Some vessels would move to the inner system for the joint coordination session that Verith Kyle had agreed to. Others would remain at the outer relay. The Resolute Order would eventually need to undock from Verith Station and rejoin the formation. The specific arrangement of ships and station and stars that existed right now in this viewport was temporary, as all arrangements are, and I had been in enough moments to know that the ones worth holding in your attention are the ones you are still inside of rather than the ones you try to reconstruct afterward. Tell me something, I said. Dale glanced at me. What? During the 16 hours when you were holding the formation in the dark, waiting for my confirmation, what did you think about? He considered the question. He was not a person who gave reflexive answers to real questions. He thought before he spoke, which was a quality I had valued in him since we served together 10 years earlier in a different context on a mission that was also classified and also mattered, and that I still thought about sometimes in the way you think about things that formed you. I thought about whether we had built the right thing. He said, not the fleet, the idea behind the fleet. And I thought, yes, but thinking yes and knowing yes are different. You can reason your way to yes 1,000 times and still not be certain until you see what the yes produces. He paused. I knew this morning, when you sent the confirmation message. One character, but the way it came through, the timing of it told me something before I even processed the content. What did it tell you? That you were ready, he said, not nervous, not hoping, ready. There is a difference. And I have been reading your messages long enough to know which one I was looking at. I looked at the station. I was nervous until the message arrived. I said honestly, after it arrived, I was ready. The message changed the state from hoping to knowing. Yes, he nodded. That was a distinction he understood. We had both given decades to this, not the same decades, not in the same ways, but decades oriented toward the same point. Dale had been building and training and maintaining a fleet that no one could acknowledge for the entirety of his command career. He had recruited officers who could not tell their families what they were doing. He had run exercises in the outer system that appeared on no official record. He had managed the logistics of supplying 312 ships across construction platforms that did not appear on any public registry. The administrative weight of what he had been carrying for 11 years was something I had been adjacent to without being inside of, and I had enough perspective on it to understand that what it required of a person was very specific and very costly. I had asked him once, early in my work with the program, whether he ever had second thoughts. He said no. I had asked why not. He said, because second thoughts require a second option worth thinking about, and he had looked at the standard compact membership terms and decided that there was not one. That answer had stayed with me across 12 years, not because it was inspiring in any formal sense, but because it was the kind of assessment you can renew every morning. You do not need inspiration to renew it. You need only to look at the alternatives and confirm that your conclusion about them has not changed. Tonight I had looked at Brethkel's face and watched the model update. I had watched 312 ships hold a formation in the dark for 16 hours. I had watched Council adding rise from a chair and used 60 years of accumulated patience in a single procedural move. I had read a proposal back to an admiral in a side chamber and watched him decide to engage with it as a serious document. My conclusion had not changed. It had, if anything, settled into a new kind of certainty that was different from the certainty of conviction which you carry before a thing is tested, and closer to the certainty of evidence which you carry after. The door was open that was real and provable in mind to carry back through tomorrow. I put the comm down, turned off the light, and slept.